It's June 5th, 2026, Friday. Let's wrap the week with a story that has a real lesson in it. China's one child policy aimed to ease population pressure, but instead produced a 30 million person gender imbalance and a shrinking workforce that will shape the country for decades. In the spring of 1983, family planning workers in rural Sichuan moved from village to village with quotas and ultrasound machines. They recorded births and enforced the new national limit of one child per couple. The measure had been introduced 3 years earlier by senior leaders who believed rapid population growth would block economic modernization. Within a generation, the same policy that sought to create a smaller, more prosperous population had produced millions of missing girls. It also created an inverted age structure. A cohort of only children emerged whose social and economic effects are still unfolding. The policy originated in the late 1970s under Deng Xiaoping. China was emerging from the Cultural Revolution and the chaotic population surges of the Mao era. Between 1949 and 1979, the population had roughly doubled to nearly 1 billion. Officials feared that continued high fertility would overwhelm food supplies, schools, and job creation. A small group of systems analysts, most prominently missile scientist Song Jian, applied cybernetic models borrowed from military planning. They argued that a strict one-child limit for roughly 20 years would bring the total population down to an optimal 700 million by the middle of the 21st century. At the time, the calculations appeared rigorous. The trade-off seemed acceptable: short-term reproductive sacrifice for long-term per capita gains in living standards. Provincial experiments with two-child limits in the 1970s had already shown fertility could be lowered quickly when local cadres were given clear targets and resources. National leaders, therefore, viewed the one-child rule not as an experiment in social engineering, but as a necessary, time-limited intervention supported by the best quantitative tools available. The policy was formally announced in 1980 and written into the Constitution in 1982. Urban work units and rural production teams received annual birth quotas. Couples who exceeded them faced fines scaled to local income, loss of housing and education benefits, and in some documented cases, workplace or administrative pressure to terminate pregnancies. Early data appeared encouraging. The total fertility rate fell from roughly 2.8 in 1979 to around 1.8 by the mid-1980s. Official reports credited the policy with preventing several hundred million births. Implementation was never uniform. Rural families whose first child was a girl were often permitted a second birth after a waiting period. Ethnic minorities and some frontier regions were largely exempt. By the early 1990s, portable ultrasound machines had spread to county hospitals. They allowed earlier determination of fetal sex and accelerated a practice that had previously been limited to postnatal selection. The most immediate distortion was a sharp rise in the recorded sex ratio at birth. By the 2000 census, the national ratio had reached 117 boys for every 100 girls. In several provinces, it exceeded 120. Families facing the one-child constraint and still holding a cultural preference for sons used the new technology of ultrasound to practice sex-selective abortion on a scale large enough to remove an estimated 30 to 40 million females from the population over 3 decades. The resulting marriage market imbalance left millions of men, especially poorer rural men, unable to form families. Later studies have linked this imbalance to higher rates of crime and social instability in regions with the most skewed cohorts. At the same time, the policy compressed the period during which large numbers of working-age adults supported a relatively small elderly population. When the first only child generation reached employment age, the dependency ratio began to rise rapidly. By 2020, there were roughly 2.5 workers for every person over 65. This marked a reversal of the favorable ratio that had underpinned earlier growth. The social experience of singleton children, often called little emperors, produced measurable differences in personality and consumption patterns. Parents and grandparents concentrated resources on one offspring. Yet these micro-level effects were secondary to the macro-demographic squeeze. Because fertility had already been falling before 1980, isolating the policy's exact contribution remains difficult. The speed and uniformity of the decline clearly exceeded what voluntary trends alone would have produced. By the early 2010s, internal government reports and academic demographers were documenting the labor force contraction and the growing cost of elder care. In 2015, the central government ended the one-child limit. It introduced a universal two-child policy effective January 1st, 2016. 3 years later, the rule was further relaxed to 3 children. Birth numbers rose modestly in 2016 and then resumed their decline. This indicated that economic pressures, housing costs, and changed expectations now outweighed the earlier legal constraint. The gender imbalance among young adults persists. It will affect marriage and caregiving patterns into the 2040s. Provincial governments have introduced cash subsidies and extended maternity leave, yet none have reversed the underlying age structure created between 1980 and 2015. Demographic policies set in motion processes whose full consequences appear only after a full generation has passed. This makes reversal costly and slow. When a single quantitative target is given enforcement power over a complex social system, families will adapt in ways the original models did not anticipate. This is especially true when technology supplies new means of compliance. Any intervention that alters the age or sex composition of a population therefore carries compounding fiscal and social obligations that extend far beyond the original planning horizon. The question for today's policymakers is, which current numerical targets, whether for carbon, housing, or migration, may similarly lock in imbalances whose correction will fall to people not yet born? That wraps today's case. The lessons travel further when you share them. Send this episode to someone who'd find it useful. We'll see you tomorrow. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts covering tech, science, markets, and more. If you enjoyed today's episode, give Environmental Intelligence a listen, the Environment and Climate Policy Brief for Canada. You can explore the whole lineup at naranetwork.com. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.